All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on emergency preparedness, which will include presentations from Matthew Cannonberg of West Rock, George Colsar from Sunoco, and Douglas Stillwell from International Paper. We're pleased that you guys are all able to join us today. Before we begin, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items. I ask at this time everyone mutes their phones so our presenter is not continuing with any background noise. You should have been automatically muted as you joined the call, but just in case. If you do have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit them using the chat function. That's in the lower left-hand portion of your screen. You can enter the question there, and it will appear on all of the presenters' screens. So please feel free to submit your questions as we go. We will answer those all at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available on PPSA's website in the next couple of weeks, along with the slides from today's presentation. This webinar is being sponsored by PPSA, the Pulp and Paper Safety Association. PPSA offers a variety of educational opportunities, including our annual conference, which will take place this year in just a couple of weeks, June 23rd to the 26th in San Antonio, Texas. Additionally, we'll have an HPI workshop at the conclusion of that, the day-and-a-half workshop, which will be led by Shane Bush as the instructor. Would like to just take a moment and remind everyone that this webinar is being conducted in accordance with PPSA's antitrust policy. Specifically, there'll be no discussing of pricing or anything of that nature. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Matthew.
Sure. Thank you, Emma. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Happy to be here. My name is Matthew Cannonberg. I'm Director of Safety for West Rock for our mills, our recycle collection facilities, and our forestry group. I'm going to talk to you about some lessons learned from a natural disaster that we had impact one of our larger mills in Panama City, Florida on October 10th of 2018. Certainly, the response by the employees and the site and the company was a great effort by all involved, but with everything, this was a unique disaster, primarily because it was probably the worst-case scenario from infrastructure damage. I won't go so far as to say worst-case scenario overall because we did not have any loss of life during that hurricane, so certainly that was a great outcome of that disaster. But certainly with any event that we actually go through a real case scenario, we had lots of lessons learned that I wanted to share today. A little bit about the Hurricane Michael for those that might not have had the opportunity to listen to the weather or the event unfold, but Hurricane Michael was a hurricane that lasted from October 7th, 2018 through October 16th, 2018, and it made landfall just east of Panama City across what's called Mexico Beach, Florida. Hurricane Michael was the first Category 5 hurricane to strike the contiguous United States since Andrew in 1992. In addition, it was the third most intense Atlantic hurricane to make landfall in terms of pressure behind the 1935 Labor Day hurricane and Hurricane Camille of 1969. So when I say worst case scenario, that's why I kind of draw to that. Maximum sustained winds were 160 miles an hour when it made landfall. And for the Panama City Mill saw 155 mile per hour winds for 2 hours straight. So reflecting on what was the most significant impact for the mill itself, it was the wind. They did have some storm surge, but it was minimal, and the biggest effect for the facility was the wind. So in reflection, after the hurricane actually caused significant infrastructure damage, not only to the mill but also the city of Panama City. A few stats before I move on to some lessons learned. About 20% of our employees had significant damage to their home, which at some point after the hurricane required them to the home to not be lived in for a certain period of time. So for the numbers, we had 500 employees at the mill, so that's about 100 employees that at some point after had to vacate their home, either immediately or sometime later for damage repair. I will say, even if we had employees that were not impacted, almost 100% of the employees had either a family member, a mother or a father or a brother or sister that had significant damage to the home. As far as damage to the facility, it caused the facility to be down approximately 30 days at about half capacity, and we returned to full capacity within 6 months. Immediately after the hurricane, we had 12 structures that were destroyed, and 100% of the buildings had roof damage. So that's just a little bit of the stats associated with it. I'm going to kind of start from an umbrella approach to what I suggest in lessons learned. You know, a natural disaster such as a hurricane should be just one part of an overall enterprise crisis management plan. Now, one of the lessons learned, and I want to make sure folks understand, is there should be two distinct plans. The corporate enterprise should have a plan, and the site should have a plan. And very critical to that is they must be aligned. And when I say they must be aligned, what the corporate enterprise expects of the site, they need to know that, and vice versa, what the site expects to get help when needed, those expectations need to be shared with corporate, so that when an event occurs, the communication is much easier and seamless, and there's not as many surprises in the aftermath. So most companies have a crisis management plan, which includes bomb threats, weather, domestic violence, a whole litany of potential crises. But I will encourage you to recognize that a natural disaster such as a hurricane is a significant different occurrence than any other event, because of the potential for catastrophic damage across not only operations but infrastructure and the community. So it in itself needs its own special placeholder in the overall crisis management plan, with its own triggers and with its own risk assessments. In this particular case, for Hurricane Michael, obviously it was the worst level of crisis that our company could have, and we triggered a team, and that team stayed with the Panama City facility for multiple months until they were up and running again. So after the hurricane and well into after the cleanup and everything got settled, we came back and modified the disaster protocol, which was specifically designed for natural disasters. I encourage you to recognize there's one primary threshold if you look at this chart in regard to the response levels. If you're looking at what a natural disaster can do, it's going to primarily fall within three categories. It's going to disrupt your operations, your runnability. So, for example, if the electric company goes down and you rely on the outside electrical company, then your operations would be impacted, even if you could run your facility as is and it did not get damaged. The second category is impact to infrastructure. And again, that could be infrastructure to the site or infrastructure to commodities that you need brought into the facility. And then thirdly, impact to the community. If your employees are impacted, especially a large number, I would say 80% of the Panama City employees were impacted in some way, either their own home or their family's home. It was multiple weeks before a large percentage of those folks could get back to the facility. And rightfully so, the company encouraged employees to take care of their family first and get their house in order before returning. So when you anticipate or you plan for natural disasters, the site can only handle a certain level. And in our risk matrix, that's primarily level 1 and level 2. When it gets to level 3, 4, and 5, the site is really going to need outside help to help them get through the event. And for Hurricane Michael, it was definitely a level 5 with high impact to operations, infrastructure, and the community. So just something to think about when you're determining the individual plans, either the enterprise, the corporate plan, or the site plan, and the individual support functions. So for the site and for corporate, there needs to be individual functional plans. We've improved these since Michael in a much more aligned fashion. So all of these functions, obviously, you have at a site, and then from a enterprise standpoint, you have at a corporate level. We have been developing individual plans and improving those since Michael, and it is imperative that each of the corporate functions run a scenario that they would have to support the site and help manage the site in the aftermath of a natural disaster. Some examples would be finance. There were no banks operational within probably 3 hours of Panama City after Hurricane Michael. And for multiple weeks, employees had no way to get their paychecks. So it's incumbent upon us to help them because we care about them. And there's lots of things that go into that if we're getting money to employees outside of their normal payroll. So there's lots of details. There's lots of tax implications that you have to figure out what to do. But that's one example. From a communication standpoint, the entire city was without 2 of their cell phone providers, one in particular for 30 days, and it was the primary cell phone communication company. So the site had no way to push out any orders, to receive anything. If you just imagine your entire site network going down for 30 days, if you want to run or start to run, what are you going to do the basic IT activities to run the facility? So the corporate IT function would have to have some contingency plans for those catastrophic events. Procurement, obviously there's lots of challenges there. I think trailers became one of the most sought-out commodities in the entire U.S. Shortly after Hurricane Michael. We were having to, ship trailers for office trailers, I remember one coming from Vermont and one coming from the Midwest, and there was just nothing available to ship in that particular region. So there's lots and lots of opportunity to think, what if you lost trailers? What if you lost your security buildings? What if you lost your medical building? And that was some examples for our facility. The medical and first aid building was destroyed. The security offices were destroyed. Some warehouses were destroyed. And to help the facility get going, we had to procure lots and lots of trailers. Going on to the site plans, folks, I've been in this industry for 27 years, and year after year after year, I've practiced and always thought that I had a good site plan. But supporting the Panama City facility and going down, I was down in Panama City for 3 weeks after, and they had a really good site plan. But I will tell you, nothing can prepare you for a direct hit of a Category 5 in regards to planning. It's virtually impossible to plan every nuance that you could possibly think of when the devastation was that broad-reaching. I will tell you that the company, West Rock, really did a jam-up job. We supplied fuel, ice, tarps, water, propane for our employees for multiple months. When we did that primarily because we care about them, and secondly, we knew that if they could not get themselves straightened away at their homes, they would never be able to come back and help get the facility going. So the more we could do to help them gave peace of mind that we cared about them, and secondly, that we were committed to restoring the operation there at Panama City, and it gave them confidence to work hard to get back to the site. I strongly suggest those sites that are doing a site plan from an operational standpoint. I encourage you to not start with a shutdown plan. I encourage you to start with an operational cold startup plan. What is it going to take to start up after the facility's been shut down for multi-weeks? And it's similar to start up from an outage or a shutdown, but you have to think about, there are certain situations. If you look at bullet 4, what is full, what is empty. If you do have warning, such as a hurricane, there's certain things you want full and certain things you want empty. And I'll give you an example. I encourage you, if you have an imminent threat of a hurricane, empty all your dumpsters, because when you come back, you need empty dumpsters, because you're going to have roofing material, you're going to have debris and damage everywhere. There are certain tanks that you might want full. There's certain tanks you might want empty, depending on the risk of those tanks being disrupted. But if you start with a cold startup plan and work backwards, it will help you with the operational shutdown plan if you've done it in that manner. I encourage you to practice. I know from past experience, if we had a hurricane watch that had had my former facility in the path, even if a week out, we would do a tabletop just to practice, spend an hour, and go down through those operational shutdown and startup plans. It's really important to do, because Panama City did that, and it served them well, because they had already gone through the motions before, and they did a great job in the shutting down the facility in advance of the hurricane. Individual support function plans, again, you need to align with your business unit support function. So the site environmental needs to share their plan with the corporate support function to make sure that they align. Communication plan is critical, that you get a way to account for everyone. The Panama City mill had 500 employees, and it took 7 days to account for all 500. Now, that might seem like a long time, but there were just a handful of folks that took that long. The majority of the employees were accounted for within 48 hours. But again, all communication in that region was out, so we were having to go door to door throughout the week to find people. The last thing I want to say is one of probably the most difficult things for me personally was right after the hurricane. We were very focused on site safety. But each day we started hearing of employees fall off their roof. We heard employees getting their legs, severely cut by chainsaws. I encourage you in advance of a imminent hit of a natural disaster to send home some type of home safety alert around those type of things, because it was not fun each day to hear 7 days in a row after the hurricane. Each day we had a pretty serious personal injury at home by an employee, and it was difficult because we would want the employees to take the same level of care as they would at work around safety. So that's just a little bit of an overview. We are going to cover this management system at the PPSA conference, and I'll go through more details of the impact. But for today, that's all I have, and I will pass it on to George.
Matthew, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining the call. My name is George Colasar. I'm the Division Safety Manager for Paper North America for Sunoco. And like Matthew talked about, what I'm going to cover in the next 5 or 6 slides is a little bit about a disaster that we experienced last year ourselves as well. And the title that I put on these slides are Disaster Recovery, Are You As Ready As You Think You Are? And the reason I ask that is because when we were in the middle of this disaster, we realized that we were not as ready as we thought we as we thought we were, or as we thought we should have been. So I'm going to go through some things for you guys to think about as you look at your emergency action plan. These are some real-life experiences that, like Matthew talked about, that we experienced that we were not prepared for. And it caused us some hurdles to overcome. It probably delayed us in getting things done and back in order. But at the end of the day, we learned from it, and we're going to share some of that with you guys today. So maybe if you have something happen, you may have thought about this after Matthew and I and Doug talk about what we're going to go through today. So what happened in Sunoco was last year, Hurricane Florence came through the East Coast, and she dropped a record amount of rainfall. The water that we experienced, we had a flood, was a 120-year record high water level. And some of the details of the flood that we had happened to us, we had over 400 electric motors under water, for example. Our fire system was completely knocked out of service. And for our paper complex, that is not a good position to be in, right? Our finished warehouse was flooded. We had access bridges, 2 motor vehicle bridges and 1 utility bridge that were damaged from the force of the floodwaters. And we had, like Matthew described, over 400 employees that were potentially affected by the flood and the events that occurred after it. This is a picture of the complex. Looking at it from the northeast, you can see the floodwaters from the left of the picture. You can see from the left of the picture to the right. This area right here is the power department. It experienced 61 inches of water in this area here. Over here is our finished warehouse building. It also experienced almost 70 inches of water inside the building. And then up through this area was the paper mill complex proper, which all the basements were completely flooded, and then some into the area back here. The dam which caused all this commotion is off to the right. Right here is where the dam is, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. So what happened? When the flood began, we implemented our normal emergency protocol. The dam or lake behind the mill, we opened all the floodgates, and we began to drain the water. We actually started draining the water before the hurricanes hit land because we knew that there was potential rainfall. One of the things that we were not prepared for that caused us some problems was that there were several organizations upstream of us that also began to dump their water. Without coordinating any of those events and sequencing any of that together, the water that they dumped overwhelmed our dam, which caused us not to be able to dump fast enough, resulting in the water rising quicker than we anticipated and it helped cause the flood. So the water increased at a higher level because of upstream companies dumping their dams as well, because they're trying to stay out of the flood water levels as well. But being downstream of that, it didn't bode well for us. So once the flooding stopped, however, that's when the real work actually began. So here's some things that we didn't consider and had some major effects on our operations. So you guys need to think about this in your emergency action plan. When you talk about equipment recovery and reconditioning, we had over 400 electric motors that needed repaired or replaced. And when you think about the amount of that, it may not sound like a lot, but some of these were of the size that you can't just go buy them at the local hardware store. We had to take them out and get them reconditioned because there were not even any available in the U.S. to replace them with. So do you have a plan? Do you have a vendor? Do you know who that could be? Pumps and gearboxes were in the same situation. We had to drain them and recondition all of them to get them back into service. We had electrical gear that needed replaced. It was full of swamp water by the time the flood receded. And then the biggest one was electronic controls. Believe it or not, some of our electronic controls were in the basement, and when it flooded, it resulted in a disaster for those controls. We're talking like computers, PLCs, highly delicate electronic devices that don't bode well when they're submerged in water. So we weren't prepared for that very well. Manpower for the cleanup. When all this started, Sunoco made the commitment that we were not going to lay off any of our employees. We kept them all on staff. However, we realized early on that we did not have enough people to do the cleanup necessary as a result of this giant flood. The good news is that our insurance carrier provided us with the name of a contract company that came in and provided manpower. Within 2 days of the event of the floodwaters receding, within 2 days of that, they had over 300 people on site with buckets and shovels and brooms cleaning up our paper mill. So when you think about, we have roughly 400 employees there. We added another 350. So we had over 700 people that were in the process of cleaning up this paper mill, mostly in the basement area. Structure evaluation, because of the severity of the flood, the bridges were damaged, as I mentioned earlier. They shifted. They were off limits, which created problems of getting equipment back and forth from one side of the mill to the other. We had to go around through the city on a city street. Causes issues, right? We weren't prepared for that. Until we had those bridges evaluated and recommissioned, they were out of service. So if you have utilities that run across things like that, we had steam lines, water lines, electric lines across the utility bridge that all had to be inspected, some repaired before we could recommission back into service. And we were not prepared for that either. So we had to elicit some contractors to come in and help us to get that back in order. Product recovery, of course, is, we had warehouses that were flooded. We had to put a plan together to recover what was not damaged and to deal with what product was damaged from the events of the flood. The other thing that was kind of interesting for Sunoco, we had just recently, within the year, switched our general liability insurance to a new carrier. So knowing the details of your policy is very, very important. We actually knew the details of ours because we had just negotiated and settled a new deal. So our carrier provided a tremendous amount of support. They provided financial support. They were on site within 3 or 4 days. They wrote us a check to start covering some of the expenses that we were experiencing from the flood within the limits of the policy and helping us get back into gear. They had the recommendations that as I mentioned earlier about cleanup crews. The company that they recommended came on site. They do this that's what they do. They knew exactly what to happen. And what was amazing to me is that within like 3 days they had a drop mailbox, UPS and FedEx set up in our parking lot, and we're getting stuff faster than we could just because of the connections and the way that they work and how they move things around. It was amazing to me how well they were organized and can handle disasters like that. Equipment support, the insurance carrier provided a lot of equipment support for replacing our motors. They had several contacts. And in fact, other paper companies like WestRock, for example, provided us with some equipment to help us get back into service. So contacts, do you have contacts? Do you know who they are? Do you know how to get a hold of them? Do you know what they have in the event of emergency? Was a big deal. And then the insurance carriers also provided engineering support. When we talk about bridges being upset, structural issues potential in the basements, they provided civil engineers. They provided guys that would come in and take a look at it, do evaluations, and help us get things back into order. And they also provided constant oversight and inspection. I mean, at the end of the day, they're paying a lot of the bills with the insurance policy kicking in. And so they were constantly involved with our cleanup efforts, our equipment reconditioning and refurbishing and putting things back in order. It took us 17 days to get the mill cleaned up and back into service. And it doesn't sound like a very long period of time, but when you're faced with a disaster like that, we had people that were working 16, 20-hour days, crews that were working around the clock, from managers, leaders of the company, contractors, all the support groups. We did meet twice a day. We met in the morning, we met in the evening. We reviewed our plan, our accomplishments, and then what the task list was for the next 12 hours. We did keep all of our employees on the payrolls. We felt it was beneficial for them to be at work. We did have some, like Matthew talked about, that had issues at home, and we gave them whatever they needed to get time, or we even provided some resources as well to get back, because like Matthew said, when you're ready to start up, you need everybody back to work, all hands on deck. So it was important for us to help them so when it was time for us to start up, they were able to do their jobs. The recovery team recommended a lot of improvements to our emergency action plan, some of the things we talked about already, and then there was a lot more that we talked about as far as, well, we weren't ready for that. And then the complex returned to full operations 17 days after the event happened. That's what I had for my presentation. I look forward to seeing everybody at the PPSA conference in a few weeks, where we'll be talking more about disaster preparedness. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Doug.
Hi, Doug Stillwell with International Paper. With 42 mills and over 200 converting sites around the globe, we've had no shortage of emergencies, and they range from the floods and the hurricanes that we've talked about here to earthquakes, tornadoes, major fires, explosions, etc. Rather than get too redundant and talk about the flood and the hurricanes that we've all experienced here in the last year or so, I'm going to go back an extra year and talk about an explosion that we had at our Pensacola mill. You may have heard about it previously because we issued an industry-wide alert afterwards to around some of the manufacturing aspects. But I'd kind of like to walk you through a little bit of that and just then what that did to kind of help us refocus on our emergency response. I would say that every emergency response that we have been involved in is different and probably will, and so having a good after the action review is an important step. and I'll emphasize that probably again later on. I'll also echo the fact that we'll have more time to talk about all this in Texas in a few weeks. So if we don't cover it all today, we'll have more time and be able to get through it at that point. So one of the things about planning for emergencies is they never happen at the right time. So it was a Sunday evening, and the National Football League was about to play one of their championship games in late January, and so attention was elsewhere, and we had a digester blow its top. It dropped the top of the digester into the powerhouse and onto the floor of the generator building, and everything went dark. You can imagine it going dark because at that point it has broken most of the electrical and steam going through the powerhouse, roof. And so that's where the emergency starts, but it's just the beginning of the emergency process. But at the very start of this thing, you've got a shortage of supervision on the plant site, and folks, frankly, in transit from a lot of different locations, and you've got communications gaps, and you don't have power. So that's kind of how the whole thing started. And as that digester blew, not only did it blow the top into the powerhouse, it blew the contents across a nearby highway and into an adjacent neighborhood. So we're now dealing with two emergencies at once. One is the on-site emergency, and the other is the off-site or community emergency. So without dwelling too much on the rest of the details of this particular emergency, and we can go into them in more detail in San Antonio. And if you are interested, there is just Google IP Pensacola explosion 2017, and you'll find a pretty good rundown in the local press. It's always good, if you can, to know what your priorities are as you go into an emergency, because your priorities, as much as your plan, are going to help get you through this. And we've tried to simplify what our objectives or our priorities are, and they are people. We start there. It's making sure that the people that we had at the site are safe, the people that we bring into the site, either as emergency responders or as help to get us through the disaster recovery, are safe. It's the environment, how we protect the environment either from what has already happened or what could happen after the fact. It's the assets, and we've had a couple of folks talk about how their assets were impacted, and of course everybody's interested in doing what they can to preserve the assets and lastly get those assets back up, restored, producing. But you've got some other parts of that restoration to keep in mind, and one of those is the restoration of your reputation, and particularly when you had an on-site causing impacts off-site, there are some other implications that need to be dealt with. There are an awful lot of aspects. This is probably nothing new to any of you, to a good emergency plan and a good emergency response. I'm going to touch on 2 or 3 of those, things that we kind of learned at the Pensacola explosion. And again, there's a lot more there. But before I do that, I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about what went right at Pensacola. And I will emphasize that a lot more went right than went wrong. On the plus side, there were no fatalities from the initial event. There were no fatalities or serious injuries in that initial event. There were no fatalities or injuries in the initial response. And there were no fatalities or significant injuries in the cleanup or the restart. So that's the good news there. Site personnel went to their muster points, and we had a pretty good accounting of personnel in 45 minutes or so, but the double checks and the assurances took a little bit longer. And the first question from management at any level is almost always going to be, how is everybody? And so being able to answer that question is important. It's also very important if you want to dispatch the emergency response crews to the right places. Internal notifications were well done. External notifications were well done. The local incident command and emergency responders did a good job, particularly for the on-site parts of the emergency. And one of the things that International Paper is extremely good, and that is flowing resources in a time of need. And business and enterprise resources started flowing towards Pensacola within hours, followed shortly then by our contractors, consultants, and other technical experts. There were some things that did need to be shored up after this, some of which go back to communicating with others. Not all the initial notifications to all the internal stakeholders were made. We kind of developed an ad hoc team to deal with some of the off-site impacts. That was quickly absorbed into a command structure that included EPA and a whole host of others in this unified command structure that we'll talk about more when we get to San Antonio. We also didn't have a good handle on where to get remediation contractors or these expert cleanup contractors, but we did have people inside the company who knew where to go. And we had a whole host, especially because of these off-site impacts, of agencies who started flowing into the Pensacola area and into the mill. And we didn't have a good way or a good understanding of how to work with them. Again, something that we'll talk about more in San Antonio, I'm sure. Accounting for all of the people, the evacuees, is something that I want to kind of touch on here and skip some of the communication pieces for now. But we had no power, and we had multiple gates, and probably many of you do too. It was dark, and finding out that everybody was safe and double-checking that process was extremely arduous. And it is something that is extremely important because you don't want to send emergency responders in to look for people who are safe. But on the other hand, if they are not safe, you definitely want to flow the resources in the right direction. So we've been trying to shore that up. I would say that we do not have the magic bean at the moment to solve that problem, but we are certainly working in the direction on that. One other thing, and again, I think from a time perspective that we'll want to deal with probably in San Antonio is this whole concept of incident command. And because of the neighborhood impacts, we were put into what was called a unified command structure, something that we did not have a lot of experience with, and that caused a little bit of angst, but something that we were able to quickly work through. Again, I think San Antonio is a better place to talk about that than here today, but it's where your incident commander sits with incident commanders from all the other stakeholders, and you have a joint command of the incident. In this particular case, it was the off-site portion of the incident. They had no real interest in trying to manage the inside the fence line piece. But as one of the other speakers said earlier, you've got to make sure that all these plans need to mesh, and they do, and it's extremely important that we have plans that mesh not only with the site, with the enterprise, with the local responders and whatever agencies show up, because we all have to play towards a common goal and end up with the best outcome we can given the emergency that we're faced with. I'm going to touch just briefly on communications and just in one or two quick slides here. We have had for years an old-fashioned calling tree to make notifications in an emergency. And when you have as many calls going out and coming in as you do in an emergency, that may not be the best way to communicate, and you all ought to be thinking about how to get around that. And the last thing I'm going to say today is social media is out there. The incident was known on social media faster than we could make phone calls. And you can be part of the conversation on social media, or they'll be talking about you on social media. It's kind of your choice, but it's going to happen. And if it becomes the primary source of information, it's probably because you let it become the primary source of information. With that, I'll end my comments for today and ask if there are questions on any of the presentations that you've heard today, and look forward to seeing you all in San Antonio. If not, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. So we'll just give it a couple minutes here. Again, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to submit those in the chat function in the lower left-hand portion of your screen right there, and we will get those out to the presenters. Not seeing any questions come in just yet. George, Matthew, or Douglas, any of you guys have any last-minute comments or anything you'd like to make?
None from me.
I'm good.
This is Matthew.
Great.
I'm good. Happy to talk about this over good tequila.
Well, okay. Good. So I guess since we're not seeing any questions coming just yet, you will be prompted with a brief exit survey as you leave the webinar today. So if you do have any questions that kind of come up as you're getting offline, please feel free to leave them there. Leave any comments you have as well. We'd be more than happy to. We really appreciate your feedback there as well. We hope to see you guys in San Antonio. And with that, this concludes today's webinar. Thank you guys for all joining us.